Hey guys, welcome back to Mr. Cursed. Today's video is going to mess with your head. I've got 8 real stories about feral people living deep in the Appalachian Mountains. And trust me, these aren't your typical scary stories. These actually happened. After hearing these, you'll never look at the woods the same way again. But real quick, if you love creepy content, hit that subscribe button and smash the like. Share this with your friends if you dare. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. All right. Let's dive into the darkness. I was 20 when I was working part-time at my uncle's auto shop in rural Virginia, trying to save up enough money to maybe go back to school or figure out what the hell I wanted to do with my life. The shop was nothing fancy, just a 2-bay garage on the outskirts of a town so small it didn't even have a proper name, just a post office box number. My Uncle Jerry had been running the place for almost 30 years, fixing up trucks and tractors for the farmers and loggers who lived scattered across the mountains. I'd been helping him out since I was 16, learning the trade while earning some cash. Honestly, I was pretty good with my hands, and Jerry always said I had a natural feel for engines. The work was steady, if not exciting, and it kept me busy while I tried to figure out my next move. That Tuesday morning in late October started like any other. Jerry was already 3 cups of coffee deep when I rolled in around 7, and he had that look on his face that meant someone was about to get stuck with a job nobody wanted. He handed me a clipboard with a work order clipped to it and jerked his thumb toward the tow truck parked outside. "Got a recovery job for you," he said, not looking up from the engine he was working on. "Customer brought in paperwork yesterday for a truck that's been sitting abandoned up on Raven Hollow Road for 3 weeks now. Owner never came back to claim it. Insurance company wants it towed." I looked at the paperwork. The truck was about 12 miles up a dead-end logging road that branched off from Raven Hollow. I knew the area. It was deep mountain country, the kind of place where cell service disappeared and the trees grew so thick you could barely see the sky. Most folks avoided going up there unless they had business, and even then, they didn't stay long. "Why didn't they just leave it there?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Insurance companies didn't like loose ends, and an abandoned vehicle was exactly that. "Because they're paying us to bring it back," Jerry said, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "Keys are supposedly still in it. Should be a simple job. Hook it up and drag it back. You can handle that, right?" I nodded and grabbed the keys to the tow truck. The morning was crisp and clear with that sharp bite in the air that meant winter wasn't far off. The leaves were just starting to turn, painting the mountainsides in patches of red and gold. It was the kind of day that made you glad to be alive and working outside instead of stuck in some office somewhere. I figured I'd be back by lunch, maybe even earlier if everything went smoothly. The drive up to Raven Hollow took about 40 minutes, winding through increasingly narrow roads that cut deep into the heart of the mountains. The further I went, the quieter it got. No traffic, no houses, just mile after mile of thick forest pressing in on both sides of the road. The logging road that led to the abandoned truck was marked by a rusted sign that had seen better days. I turned onto what was barely more than a dirt track, feeling the tow truck bounce and sway as the road got rougher. When I finally reached the spot where the truck was supposed to be, I had to sit there for a minute just staring at what I was seeing. The truck was there, all right, a beat-up Ford pickup that looked like it had seen better decades. But it wasn't the truck that made me pause. It was everything around it. Someone had built sculptures. That's the only word I can use to describe them, though built doesn't really capture what I was looking at. These things were made entirely of bones. Human bones mixed with animal bones, all woven together in ways that shouldn't have been possible. They stood about 8 feet tall and were arranged in a perfect circle around the abandoned truck, maybe 6 or 7 of them total. The bones were clean, bleached white, and fitted together with a precision that made my skin crawl. They looked almost architectural, like someone had studied engineering before deciding to work with human remains instead of steel and concrete. I sat in the cab of the tow truck for a long moment, trying to process what I was seeing. My first thought was that this had to be some kind of art project, maybe something a local college student had put together for a class. But the more I looked at them, the more wrong they felt. These weren't the kind of thing you built for fun or to make a statement. They were functional somehow, though I couldn't figure out what their function might be. The air smelled wrong too. There was this metallic tang to it, sharp and bitter, like the taste you get in your mouth when you bite your tongue hard enough to draw blood. But underneath that was something else. Something that reminded me of battery acid, caustic and burning. I finally climbed out of the truck and walked over to get a closer look at the abandoned pickup. The paint was covered in scratches, but they weren't random. Someone had carved deliberate patterns into the metal, spirals and triangles that seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them. When I walked around to check the tires, I found human teeth embedded in the rubber. Not just a few, dozens of them, pressed so deep into the tread that they would have been impossible to remove without cutting the tire apart. That's when I heard the clicking. It started as just background noise, the kind of sound you might dismiss as insects, or maybe tree branches scraping together in the wind. But there wasn't any wind, and the pattern was too regular to be natural. 3 quick clicks, then a pause, then 3 more clicks. It repeated over and over, coming from somewhere deeper in the trees. I tried to focus on my job. I had the tow cables in my hands and was working on getting them hooked up to the pickup when I noticed more bone sculptures further back in the forest. These were different from the ones around the truck, more elaborate, more complex. Some of them incorporated what looked like fresh human hair, different colors and textures woven through the bone structure like decoration. Others had pieces of clothing attached to them, faded and weathered, but still recognizable as having once belonged to people. The clicking got louder, more urgent, and I realized it was coming from multiple sources now, like different voices having a conversation in a language made entirely of sound. I was wrestling with a particularly stubborn tow cable when I saw the first one. It came out from behind one of the larger bone sculptures, moving with a gait that made my stomach turn. At first glance, it looked human. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head where a head should be. But everything was wrong. The proportions were off, like someone had taken a person and stretched them in all the wrong directions. Its arms hung down past its knees, and its joints bent in ways that should have broken bone. The skin was pale gray, stretched tight over a frame that looked too big for it. It was carrying a bundle of bones in its arms, still red with fresh blood, arranged in a pattern I couldn't understand. When it saw me looking, it stopped and tilted its head at an angle that would have snapped a human neck. Then it made that clicking sound, and 2 more of them appeared from behind other sculptures. They didn't approach me directly. Instead, they began working, using the bones they carried to build something new. Their movements were coordinated, like they were following blueprints only they could see. The clicking sounds they made seemed to be some kind of communication system, directing each other's work with the precision of a construction crew. I realized what they were building. It was a cage, and it was being constructed on my tow truck. They worked with an intelligence that was completely alien, but undeniably real. These weren't mindless monsters or wild animals. They were builders, architects, engineers, working with materials that happened to be human and animal remains. And they were making it clear that I wasn't supposed to leave. When I tried to back away toward my truck, they moved to intercept me. Not aggressively. They never showed any signs of wanting to hurt me, but they positioned themselves between me and my vehicle, pointing back toward the bone sculptures and making those precise clicking sounds. It was like they were explaining something to me, trying to make me understand that I was part of their project now. I could see more of them moving through the trees. A lot more. They'd been watching me work, probably from the moment I'd arrived, and now they were emerging to claim whatever it was they thought I could contribute to their construction. That's when I understood that this wasn't random. The abandoned truck, the location, even my presence here, it was all part of something bigger. These things had been collecting materials for a long time, and they'd found ways to draw people to this spot. The truck was bait, and I'd walked right into their trap. I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of trying to reason with them or figure out what they wanted, I pulled out my knife and cut the tow cables. The customer's truck could stay right where it was. I wasn't dying in these mountains for an insurance company. I ran for my truck, and they followed. Not chasing exactly, but keeping pace with me with that horrible joint-bending gait. They ran alongside my truck as I bounced and skidded down the logging road, matching my speed even as I pushed the engine as hard as I dared on the rough terrain. In my mirrors, I could see them running with their arms swinging in long, impossible arcs, their heads tilted at angles that should have killed them. They followed me for miles. Even when I reached the main road and floored it, I could still see them in the distance, standing motionless at the edge of the forest, watching me leave. When I got back to the shop, I told Jerry the truck had been destroyed in a rock slide and was unrecoverable. I filed a false insurance report and never mentioned what I'd actually seen up there. Jerry grumbled about the lost towing fee, but he didn't ask too many questions. For weeks afterward, I found small bone sculptures appearing around my apartment. Nothing elaborate, just simple arrangements of what looked like bird bones and small animal remains. Someone was watching my building, leaving those clicking sounds on my voicemail. Just 3 clicks, pause, 3 clicks. I'd come home to find my furniture rearranged, my belongings organized in patterns I didn't recognize. I quit the mechanic job and moved to Richmond. I couldn't handle rural repair calls anymore, couldn't drive down logging roads or work on trucks that had been sitting abandoned in the mountains. I got a job at a chain repair shop in the city, working on cars that had nice, clean histories and owners who actually showed up to claim them. Looking back now, I know there are things out there in the mountains that collect bones and build territories with them. They're patient, intelligent, and completely outside anything we understand about the world. And I know that if I hadn't cut those cables and run when I did, they would have added me to their architectural plans. Sometimes I still wake up hearing those clicking sounds, and I know they're still out there, still building, still collecting materials for projects we'll never understand. I was 24 when I got hired as a substitute teacher covering the rural school districts out in eastern Kentucky. Honestly, it wasn't my first choice for work, but the state paid decent money, and I needed something steady after college. Most of the time, I'd just fill in at regular schools when teachers called in sick, but sometimes they'd send me out to check on homeschooled families who hadn't filed their paperwork. The state required documentation that kids were actually getting educated, and it was my job to drive out and verify everything was legitimate. That's how I ended up in Pine Ridge Gap on a cold Tuesday morning in October. The family I was supposed to visit lived about 18 miles from the nearest town, way back in the hills where the roads turned to gravel and then dirt. According to my notes, the Hendersons had 3 children between ages 8 and 14, and they hadn't submitted any required documentation for over a year. My supervisor told me it was probably just paperwork confusion, but the state needed someone to physically check that the kids were being taught. The drive took me through some beautiful country, I'll give it that. Dense forest on both sides of the road, mountains rolling away in every direction. But the further I got from town, the more isolated it felt. No houses, no mailboxes, no signs of people at all. Just trees and more trees. When I finally found their driveway, it was barely more than tire tracks leading back into the woods. The house turned out to be a converted barn, painted white but showing its age. Big structure, probably used to house livestock before someone turned it into a home. There was a cleared area around it, maybe half an acre, but beyond that the forest pressed in close on all sides. No neighbors, no other buildings visible. Just this one family living way out here by themselves. I parked next to an old pick vase, up truck and walked up to the front door. Before I could even knock, it opened. A woman stood there, maybe 40 years old, wearing a simple blue dress and an apron. She looked normal enough, but something about the way she spoke immediately struck me as odd. "You are the person who has come for the educational verification purposes," she said. Not a question, just a statement. Her grammar was perfect, but the word choice felt wrong somehow, like someone translating from another language. I introduced myself and explained why I was there. The whole time I could see children watching me from inside the house. 3 of them, just like the record said. They stood perfectly still, not moving, not speaking, just staring at me with these unblinking eyes. It made me uncomfortable, but kids can be shy around strangers, especially way out here. The mother invited me inside, and that's when I really started to notice things. The children moved in perfect synchronization, all turning their heads at exactly the same time when I entered. They were dressed identically in simple clothes, and they stayed completely silent. Not unusual for homeschooled kids to be quiet, but something about their behavior felt rehearsed. When I asked about their curriculum, the mother produced textbooks and laid them out on the kitchen table. All the right subjects, all the proper grade levels. But when I opened one of the math books, every page was blank, completely empty. I flipped through several others and found the same thing. Covers that looked normal, but nothing inside. The children learn from observation and repetition, the mother explained when I pointed this out. We practice knowledge through speaking and demonstration. The way she said it sounded reasonable enough, but her voice had that same stilted quality, like she was reciting something she'd memorized. I asked to speak with the children directly, and that's when things got really strange. The oldest boy, maybe 14, stepped forward. I asked him a simple question about what he'd been studying recently. He opened his mouth and answered, but his voice was an exact copy of mine. Same tone, same inflection, even the same slight Kentucky accent I'd picked up from living here. The other two children did the same thing when I spoke to them. They responded using my own voice, speaking words that technically answered my questions but felt hollow and meaningless. During the interview, I started noticing other things that bothered me. The children never blinked. Not once in the whole time I was watching them. Their eyes reflected light like an animal's would, catching the overhead bulb and throwing it back with an unnatural shine. When I moved, they moved. When I gestured with my hands, they made the exact same gestures a few seconds later, like they were learning my movements. The house itself felt wrong too. No mirrors anywhere, which struck me as odd for a family with teenage kids. No photographs on the walls, no personal items that showed any individual personality. Everything was clean and organized, but it felt more like a stage set than a home where people actually lived. I asked the mother about their daily routine, and she gave me a detailed answer about breakfast times and lesson schedules. But when I asked follow-up questions, she started mixing up basic concepts. She talked about feeding knowledge to the children and harvesting understanding like education was some kind of farming process. The more she spoke, the more obvious it became that she didn't really understand what she was talking about. Then I heard them speaking to each other in what sounded like English played backward. Not another language, English words, but reversed somehow, with clicking sounds mixed in. When I asked about it, they all stopped talking immediately and stared at me with those unblinking eyes. That's when I realized they were copying my facial expressions too. Every time I frowned or raised at my eyebrows, all three children would make the exact same expression a moment later. It was like looking into a funhouse mirror that delayed your reflection. I started moving more deliberately, testing my theory. I scratched my nose, they scratched their noses. I crossed my arms, they crossed their arms. I tilted my head to one side, and all three of them tilted their heads at exactly the same unnatural angle. Not like children playing follow the leader, but like they were studying me, learning how to be human by watching me demonstrate it. The mother kept talking, but her answers were getting stranger. She referred to sleeping as the daily practice of horizontal rest, and eating as consumption for biological maintenance. She talked about her husband being away gathering resources for family unit sustainability, instead of just saying he was at work. I glanced at my watch and mentioned that I needed to head back to town soon. That's when everything changed. All 5 family members, the mother and 3 children, plus a man who had appeared from somewhere in the back of the house, moved simultaneously to block the exits. Not obviously threatening, but definitely preventing me from leaving. They stood there watching me with those same unblinking stares, and I realized their skin had a waxy texture to it, like plastic masks stretched too tight over something else. Their perfect human facade started breaking down. The children's movements became jerky and mechanical. They began speaking in overlapping voices, creating this disturbing chorus effect where words echoed and repeated in strange patterns. The mother's face seemed to shift slightly, like the features weren't quite settled in place. That's when it hit me. These weren't humans pretending to be a family. They were something else entirely, something that had been studying human behavior but couldn't quite get it right. They knew the basic forms but missed all the subtle details that make us actually human. I watched in growing horror as they started copying each other instead of me, creating this feedback loop of wrong behaviors. One child would twitch, then the others would twitch in the same way. The mother would tilt her head, and everyone else would mirror the movement. Their speech devolved into repeated phrases and broken word patterns, like a recording that was skipping. They moved closer in perfect unison, all making the same clicking sounds with their mouths. I could see their faces starting to shift and change, like they were wearing loose masks that didn't quite fit. Whatever they really were underneath, it wasn't human. I realized they wanted to study me more closely, maybe add me to their collection somehow. The thought of becoming another one of their learning specimens made my skin crawl. That's when I got desperate. I started moving erratically, jumping up and down, spinning in circles, speaking complete nonsense, random words, made-up sentences, anything to break their copying pattern. They became confused and agitated when they couldn't successfully mimic my behavior. Their movements became even more mechanical as they tried to process what I was doing. While they were distracted trying to copy my random actions, I managed to reach the front door. They followed me outside, still attempting to mirror my movements but failing badly. I got to my car and drove away as fast as I could, watching them in my rearview mirror. They stood in the clearing in perfect formation, all waving goodbye in exactly the same way, at exactly the same time. I filed my report claiming the family had moved and left no forwarding address. Couldn't exactly tell my supervisor what I'd really seen out there. For months afterward, I got phone calls where someone would repeat my own words back to me in my own voice. I'd answer, say hello, and hear myself saying hello back. Eventually the calls stopped, but I never forgot that sound. I quit teaching not long after that, and moved to a different state. To this day, I avoid rural areas where families might not be what they seem. I became paranoid about people who seem too perfect or speak in unusual patterns. Sometimes I catch myself studying people's faces, looking for that waxy texture or watching to see if they blink enough. I know there are things out there that study humans and try to replace us. I barely escaped becoming their next learning opportunity, and I still wake up sometimes wondering if they figured out how to copy me properly after I left. Looking back now, I think I was supposed to disappear that day. The state would have assumed I'd gotten lost in the woods or had car trouble. No one would have looked too hard for a substitute teacher way out in Pine Ridge Gap. I never went back to find out what happened to that place, and I never will. I was 31 when I took the job as a social worker in East Tennessee, and honestly, I thought I'd seen everything by then. I'd been working child welfare cases in Memphis for about 6 years, dealing with all kinds of situations you'd rather not think about. But the state needed someone to cover the rural mountain counties, and the pay bump was too good to pass up. Plus, I figured working with families out in the country might be a nice change from the city cases that had been wearing me down. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in late October. Anonymous tip about children living in unnatural conditions up on Copper Mine Ridge, about 40 minutes outside of Cookeville. The caller wouldn't give their name, just kept saying the kids weren't quite right, and that families up there had changed overnight. I get a lot of vague reports like that, usually neighbors with grudges or people who don't understand how mountain families live. But I have to follow up on every call involving children, no matter how weird it sounds. I drove up there expecting the usual, maybe some poverty issues, kids who needed better medical care, or parents who were overwhelmed and needed resources. Copper Mine Ridge got its name for obvious reasons. There were old mining operations scattered all over those hills, most of them abandoned since the 70s. A few families still lived up there in houses that had been in their families for generations, making do however they could. The first house I visited seemed completely normal. The Hutchins family, mom, dad, and 3 kids aged 6, 8, and 10. The parents were cooperative, even grateful that someone was checking on them. The children were healthy, well-fed, and answered my questions without any problems. No signs of abuse, neglect, or trauma. The house was clean, the kids had toys and books, and everyone seemed genuinely happy to see me. I spent about an hour there, documenting everything properly, and was getting ready to file a report dismissing the anonymous concerns as unfounded. Mrs. Hutchins walked me to my car and suggested I check on the Carver family about a mile up the ridge just to be thorough. "They've got kids about the same ages," she said. "Sweet family. I think you'll find they're doing just fine too." The Carver house was similar, a little smaller, but well maintained. Mr. and Mrs. Carver met me at the door with their 3 children, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The children looked identical to the Hutchins kids. Not similar, identical. Same faces, same heights, same scars and birthmarks. The little girl even had the exact same chipped front tooth. I stared at them for what felt like a full minute, trying to process what I was seeing. The 8-year-old boy had a distinctive birthmark on his left cheek, heart-shaped about the size of a dime. I'd photographed that same birthmark an hour earlier at the Hutchins house. But when I mentioned this to the Carvers, they looked at me like I was crazy. "These are our children," Mrs. Carver said, pulling the kids closer to her. "They've always been our children. I don't know what you're talking about." The children themselves seemed confused by my questions. They answered to different names, had different memories about their lives and families, but their faces were absolutely identical to the Hutchins children. I started taking more photographs, trying to document what I was seeing, but the Carvers became increasingly uncomfortable and asked me to leave. I drove back down to the Hutchins house, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. When I showed Mrs. Hutchins the photos I'd taken at the Carvers, she studied them for a long time, then shook her head. "I don't understand what you're trying to show me." "Why," she said, "these look like normal children to me. Different from ours, of course, but normal." But they weren't different. They were exactly the same. Over the next 3 days, I visited every family on Coppermine Ridge, 7 families total, all with children. And every single family had the exact same 3 children, the same faces, the same physical characteristics, down to tiny details like freckle patterns and the way they held their heads when they listened. But the children had different personalities, different memories, different relationships with their parents. And none of the adults could see what I was seeing, even when I showed them photographs side by side. The children would change between my visits, too. I'd go back to check on a family, and the quiet, shy little girl from the day before would be outgoing and talkative. The boy who'd been afraid of my camera would suddenly be posing for pictures. When I pointed out these inconsistencies to the parents, they'd get confused and insist their children had always been exactly as they were in that moment. On my 4th day, I decided to follow one of the children when they left their house. I parked down the road and watched the Hutchins place through binoculars. Around sunset, I saw the 10-year-old boy walk out of the house alone and head into the woods behind their property. I followed him on foot, staying far enough back that he wouldn't notice me. What I saw in those woods still gives me nightmares. The boy walked to a small clearing about half a mile into the forest. There were dozens of children there, all the same 3 faces, but multiplied. Boys and girls who looked exactly like the children I'd been documenting, standing in groups, communicating without speaking. They'd touch each other's hands or shoulders, and I could see information passing between them somehow. Memories, maybe. Experiences. I watched them for almost an hour, hidden behind a fallen log. They seemed to be sharing everything they'd learned from the families they'd been living with. How each parent reacted to different behaviors, what made them happy or worried, what felt most natural and human. Then, as the sun set completely, they scattered. Different children returned to different houses, sliding seamlessly into roles as family members. The boy I'd followed wasn't the same boy who returned to the Hutchins house 20 minutes later. When I got back to my hotel room that night, I found one of them sitting on my bed, a little girl, maybe 6 years old, just watching me with those 2 familiar eyes. She didn't speak, just tilted her head at exactly the same angle I'd seen dozens of times over the past 4 days. "I know what you are," I whispered. She smiled, not a child's smile, but something ancient and patient, and disappeared. Not ran away, not hid. Just wasn't there anymore. The next morning, there were 3 of them in my room, standing by the window, watching me sleep. I packed my bags immediately and checked out, but they followed me to my car. More of them appeared along the mountain roads as I drove, standing at crossroads, sitting on fallen trees, watching from ridgelines. Always the same three faces, always perfectly still, like sentries marking my path out of their territory. I filed a report stating that no children were found at the investigated addresses. Claimed the anonymous caller had given me wrong information. 3 weeks later, I turned in my resignation and moved back to Memphis. I couldn't do the job anymore, couldn't trust that any child I met was actually human. Looking back now, 5 years later, I still research missing children cases whenever I can't sleep. I wonder how many of those kids weren't taken or killed, but replaced. How many families out there have learned to love whatever appears in their homes, to accept that their children might be different from day to day, but are still somehow theirs. I drive a different route when I have to go, through Tennessee now. I've never been back to Coppermine Ridge, and I never will. Because I know there are things out there that can take the shape of human children and entire communities that have been conditioned to accept whatever versions show up at their dinner tables. The anonymous caller never contacted our office again. I think they knew, just like I knew, that there was nothing anyone could do about what was happening up there. Some places belong to things that were there long before we were, and sometimes the best we can do is just stay away and let them have what they've claimed. To this day, I can't look at family photos without studying the children's faces too closely, searching for that wrongness I learned to recognize. Most of the time, thank God, I don't find it. But sometimes I do. I'm 26 years old and work as a cable repair technician for a company that covers the most remote parts of eastern Kentucky. Most people don't realize how much equipment it takes to keep internet and phone service running in the mountains. Towers, repeaters, underground cables snaking through valleys where cell service has never reached. It's honest work, and I don't mind the long drives or being alone most of the day. What I mind now is anything involving electronics. This happened about 3 years ago during what should have been a routine service call. We'd gotten reports that the communication tower on Devil's Backbone Mountain had been down for over a week. That tower serviced maybe 6 or 7 communities scattered through the hollows, places where people still relied on landlines and dial-up internet. My supervisor handed me the work order on a Tuesday morning and said the customer complaints were piling up. Equipment failures happen, especially during storm season, but a week-long outage usually meant something had hit the tower itself. The drive up Devil's Backbone took about 2 hours on winding mountain roads that got narrower the higher you climbed. I'd been to that tower maybe 4 times before over the past couple years. Routine maintenance, replacing weather-damaged cables, that sort of thing. It sat on a rocky outcrop maybe 300 feet from the entrance to some old limestone caves that honeycombed that whole section of mountain. Local families had been pulling coal and limestone out of those tunnels since the 1800s, though most of the mining stopped decades ago when the easier seams played out. When I finally reached the tower site, I could see immediately that this wasn't storm damage. The equipment housing at the base of the tower looked like something had grabbed it and tried to pull it underground. The metal access panels were twisted and torn, cables ripped clean out of their conduits and scattered across the rocky ground. Some of the heavier equipment, stuff that would take 2 men and a winch to move, had been dragged 15 or 20 feet toward the cave entrance. I parked my repair van and walked around the tower, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The damage pattern didn't match anything I'd encountered before. It wasn't like a car had hit it, or a tree had fallen on it, or even like someone had taken a sledgehammer to it. The metal components were twisted like they were made of soft plastic, and several of the main support cables had been snapped with what must have been incredible force. That's when I noticed the drag marks in the dirt, deep grooves that led from the scattered equipment straight toward the nearest cave opening. I followed them about 50 feet before stopping at the mouth of the cave. The air coming out of that opening felt wrong, too warm for October, and carrying a smell that reminded me of stomach acid or meat that had been sitting out too long. I went back to my van and got my equipment: flashlight, multimeter, portable radio, and a coil of replacement cable. The job was simple enough. Assess the damage, figure out what could be salvaged, and call in for whatever replacement parts we'd need. But as I started testing the damaged equipment, my multimeter kept giving impossible readings. The display would flicker and show numbers that made no sense, then go completely dead for several seconds before working normally again. My portable radio was acting up too. Instead of the usual static or country music from the valley stations, I was picking up what sounded like electronic interference, rhythmic pulses that almost seemed like Morse code but too fast and complex to decode. The interference got stronger the closer I moved toward the cave entrance. Looking back, now I should have packed up and left right then, called it in as equipment failure due to geological instability or something, but I was 26 and thought I could handle whatever weird electrical problems the mountain was throwing at me. So when I found several of our cables disappearing into that cave opening, I decided to follow them just far enough to see where they led. The cave mouth was bigger than it looked from a distance, easily wide enough to drive a pickup truck through. My flashlight beam reached maybe 30 feet before the tunnel curved out of sight, but I could see our communication cables snaking along the left wall, still in their protective housing. The rhythmic pulsing from my radio was getting louder, and I started to realize it wasn't interference. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the cave system. I followed the cables for maybe 100 yards, staying close to the left wall and testing my radio signal every few steps. The tunnel sloped downward more steeply than any mine shaft I'd ever seen, and the air kept getting warmer. That organic smell was getting stronger too, and by the time I'd gone maybe 200 yards into the mountain, I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. That's when my flashlight beam found the first feeding chamber. The tunnel opened into a circular room maybe 50 feet across, and the walls weren't limestone anymore. They were pink and wet and pulsing like the inside of something's throat. Pools of yellowish liquid covered most of the floor, and floating in those pools were pieces of metal, plastic, and electronic components in various stages of dissolution. I could make out parts of cell phone towers, sections of cable housing, even what looked like pieces of vehicles, all being slowly digested by whatever this place was. The rhythmic pulsing was much louder here, like a massive heartbeat echoing through the chamber walls. And the smell. Jesus, the smell was like being inside something's stomach. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds trying to process what I was seeing before I noticed movement in the pools. Things were rising out of the acidic liquid, human-shaped, but wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. Their bodies were translucent, like they were made of the same digestive fluid that filled the pools, and I could see partially dissolved metals and electronics floating inside them like they were part of their circulatory system. They moved like they were swimming, even though they were walking through air, their limbs undulating in slow-flowing motions that looked more like tentacles than arms and legs. One of them turned toward me, and I saw that its face was a rough approximation of human features, like something had tried to recreate a person from memory but got all the proportions wrong. When it opened its mouth, electronic sounds came out, the same rhythmic pulsing I'd been hearing on my radio, but now I could tell it was some kind of communication. That's when I understood what had happened to the communication equipment, and what had probably happened to other repair technicians who'd come up this mountain over the years. More of them were emerging from the pools now, and they were all moving toward me with that same underwater swimming motion. My flashlight was flickering wildly, the beam cutting in and out as whatever electrical field these things generated interfered with the circuits. But in the brief moments when the light held steady, I could see them reaching toward my equipment belt, toward the radio and multimeter and spare cables I was carrying. They weren't hostile exactly. It was more like they saw me as a delivery system for the electronics they needed to feed. One of them managed to grab my radio before I could pull away, and I watched in horror as it began dissolving in the thing's translucent hand, the plastic casing melting and the metal components being absorbed into its body. The chamber walls were starting to secrete more of that acidic fluid, and I realized the entire room was preparing to digest whatever had wandered into it. These things, whatever they were, had been feeding on our technology for who knows how long, learning how to operate it by literally consuming it and making it part of themselves. I started backing toward the tunnel entrance, but they followed me, moving faster now and making more of those electronic communication sounds. My multimeter was going crazy, the display scrolling through random numbers and symbols before finally dying completely. Even my wristwatch had stopped working. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze. My own voice coming from one of the creatures, saying words I'd spoken into my radio earlier. "Base, this is Unit 7, beginning site assessment." But the voice was wrong, like a recording played through broken speakers, and when I looked at the thing making the sound, I could see parts of my radio circuit board floating inside its torso. I ran. I dropped everything, the spare cables, my tool belt, even my flashlight, and ran through that tunnel as fast as I could without being able to see where I was going. Behind me, I could hear them following, but their movement seemed limited to the deeper parts of the cave system. By the time I reached the entrance, the electronic sounds had faded to almost nothing. My van wouldn't start at first. The engine would turn over but not catch, like the electrical system was somehow contaminated by whatever I'd encountered down there. I sat behind the wheel for maybe 10 minutes, trying not to think about what would happen if those things could reach the surface, before the engine finally caught and I got the hell off that mountain. I drove straight to the office and told my supervisor the tower had been destroyed by a geological event. "Rockslide," I said. "Equipment buried under tons of limestone. Site too dangerous to access." He wasn't happy about losing all that gear, but he marked it down as a total loss and filed a claim with the insurance company. That E-Way. 3 years ago, and I've never gone back to Devil's Backbone Mountain. I quit the cable company about 6 months later, and now I work construction, building houses and fixing roofs, anything that doesn't involve electronic equipment. Because even now, sometimes when I'm around too much technology, I hear those rhythmic pulses, and I remember the feeling of being inside something that was slowly digesting everything I'd brought with me. The tower on Devil's Backbone is still down. Other technicians have been sent up there over the years, but none of them come back with reports that make any sense. Equipment failures due to geological instability. That's what the official reports say. But I know there's something under that mountain that's still hungry, still feeding on whatever electronic meals wander into its caves. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear my old radio calling out across the valleys, using my voice to lure the next repair technician up that mountain road. I'm 27 years old, and I work as a freelance photographer. Well, I used to do more varied work anyway. These days I stick pretty close to wedding photography and family portraits. Nothing too adventurous. But back in 2019, I was still taking on magazine assignments, traveling around documenting different stories. That's how I ended up in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, driving down a barely maintained gravel road toward a place called Black Rock Creek. My editor at Rural America Quarterly had sent me there to photograph abandoned mining communities. The story was supposed to show how economic collapse had affected these remote mountain areas, what happened to places when the coal companies pulled out and left whole towns behind. Black Rock Creek had been completely abandoned since 2003 when the mine closed, 15 miles from the nearest active community, accessible only by deteriorating mountain roads that hadn't seen state maintenance in over a decade. I remember thinking it was perfect for what the magazine wanted. The GPS lost signal about 5 miles before I reached the town, but I had printed directions and the road only went one way. When I finally rolled into what used to be the main street, I understood why they'd sent me all the way out there. The abandoned houses were exactly what you'd picture: weathered wooden structures slowly being reclaimed by kudzu and Virginia creeper, roofs sagging under the weight of fallen trees, windows either broken or so dirty they looked black. I spent the morning photographing exteriors, documenting the slow process of nature taking back what humans had built. The September air was crisp but not cold, perfect lighting for the kind of atmospheric shots the magazine loved. I was working with my Canon 5D, taking my time to get the compositions right. Through the viewfinder, I started noticing movement in several of the supposed empty buildings. Dark figures would appear briefly in windows, too quick for me to focus on properly, but definitely there. Honestly, I wasn't surprised. I figured they were homeless people or maybe local folks using the abandoned structures for shelter. Rural Kentucky has plenty of people living off the grid, and these houses would provide decent protection from the weather, even in their deteriorated state. I made sure to keep my distance and tried not to seem threatening. The last thing I wanted was to make anyone feel like I was invading their privacy or documenting their living situation without permission. But when I got back to my truck and started reviewing the photos on my camera's LCD screen, something felt wrong about those figures. They appeared in every shot I'd taken of buildings where I'd seen movement, but they looked like dark spots that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Even in the brightest areas of the photographs, these human-shaped shadows created voids in the image, like someone had taken a hole punch to the digital file. I decided to go back and photograph the same buildings again, thinking maybe I'd caught some kind of lens flare or processing error. But when I returned to those houses, I found them completely empty. No signs of recent habitation, no belongings, no indication anyone had been there recently, except for the footprints in the dust on the porches and floors. Fresh prints that showed people had definitely been walking around, but the prints themselves were wrong. Too long and narrow, like someone wearing shoes that didn't fit properly, or maybe like human feet that had been stretched somehow. The air around certain buildings felt different too. Thicker, harder to breathe, like the atmospheric pressure had changed just in those specific spots. I'd been doing outdoor photography for years, and I'd never experienced a thing like it. Usually you notice air quality changes across larger areas, weather fronts moving in, altitude changes, that sort of thing. This was localized to individual structures, sometimes just to specific rooms within those structures. I was setting up for another shot of the old company store when I saw them clearly for the first time. They emerged from what looked like a collapsed mine entrance about 50 yards behind the main street, moving in a way that immediately told me something was fundamentally wrong. They looked human at first glance, the right height, walking upright, human proportions. But they were completely black, not like clothing or skin color, but like living shadows that had somehow gained substance and mass. Their movements were fluid but wrong, like they were walking underwater or through some medium thicker than air. When I tried to focus my camera on them, the autofocus kept hunting, unable to lock onto their forms, even though they were clearly visible to my naked eye. And despite being solid enough to leave footprints, they cast no shadows on the ground beneath them. That's when they started talking to each other, and I understood that whatever I was looking at wasn't human anymore. Their voices echoed from inside their bodies, hollow and reverberating like someone speaking into an empty barrel. I couldn't make out words at first, just the sound of conversation with that strange internal echo quality. They noticed me pretty quickly after that. Within minutes, I found myself surrounded in what used to be the town square, though I never saw them actually approach. One moment I was alone. The next moment there were maybe 8 or 10 of them forming a loose circle around me. They moved with perfect coordination, no verbal communication that I could hear, like they were operating on some kind of shared consciousness. I could see through them slightly, like they were made of thick smoke that had somehow gained the ability to maintain human shape. They began mimicking my photography poses, holding their hands up like they were gripping cameras, pointing at me and at the buildings around us. Their hollow voices started whispering in unison, and I realized with genuine terror that they were repeating words I'd spoken to myself while working. Comments about lighting and composition, frustrations about equipment, even the directions I'd read aloud from my printed map. They'd been watching me all morning, listening, learning how I behaved and what I was doing there. One of them gestured toward a house that still had most of its roof intact, and somehow I understood I was supposed to follow. The whole group moved with me, maintaining their loose circle formation, still making those hollow, echoing sounds that I was starting to recognize as some form of communication between them. Inside the house, family photographs still hung on the walls despite years of abandonment. Normal family pictures, birthday parties, holidays, school events, wedding photos. The hollow people pointed at these pictures, then pointed at themselves, and I began to understand what I was looking at. These were the same people in the photographs, the former residents of Black Rock Creek. But something had happened to them, something connected to the mine collapse that had emptied the town. They weren't dead, but they weren't fully alive either. They'd been transformed into something caught between states of existence, and they wanted me to document what they'd become. They were desperate for someone from the outside world to see them, to provide proof that they still existed in whatever form they'd taken. But when I tried to photograph them directly, my camera malfunctioned. The LCD screen would flicker and go black, the autofocus would spin endlessly, and any images I managed to capture came out as completely black frames. They became increasingly agitated when the photos failed, making distressed sounds that resonated through their hollow forms. I realized they wanted desperately to be seen and documented, but whatever they'd become couldn't be captured by normal photographic equipment. I had to think fast. I told them my camera was broken and that I'd need to return with specialized equipment designed for different kinds of photography. I promised I'd come back with gear that could properly document their transformed state, show the world what had happened to the people of Black Rock Creek. They seemed to accept this explanation, though their hollow voices continued making sounds I interpreted as disappointment. They escorted me back to my truck, still maintaining their coordinated group movement, still making those echoing sounds that felt like conversation I couldn't quite understand. As I drove away, I could see them in my rearview mirror, standing in the middle of what used to be Main Street, their dark forms visible even as the distance increased. I could hear their hollow voices calling even after they disappeared from sight, and I knew they were still there, waiting in that abandoned town for someone to return and prove they still existed. I never went back to Black Rock Creek, and I never published the story. I told my editor the location was too dangerous for photography due to unstable structures and difficult access. The magazine accepted my explanation and assigned me to a different story about urban farming cooperatives, something much safer and more conventional. To this day, I sometimes develop film and find dark spots in images that shouldn't be there, even in photographs taken hundreds of miles away from eastern Kentucky. I've stopped taking assignments that involve abandoned places or isolated communities. I stick to weddings and family portraits now, work that keeps me around people who are definitely alive and definitely human. I know there are other communities like Black Rock Creek scattered throughout Appalachia, places where economic collapse and industrial disasters have left people stranded in states between existence and non-existence, and I know they're all waiting for someone to document their transformation, to provide evidence that they're still there in whatever form they've been forced to take, but that someone won't be me. Some stories aren't meant to be told, and some photographs aren't meant to be taken. I was 33, working nights delivering pizzas to the worst parts of 3 counties. The job wasn't much, but after my divorce, it kept me busy enough not to think too hard about how my life had turned out. Most drivers avoided the mountain routes, too much gas, too few tips, but I took them all. The solitude suited me, and honestly, driving those dark mountain roads with nothing but my headlights and whatever was on the radio felt more peaceful than sitting in my empty apartment. I should mention something that matters to this story. About 2 weeks before that October night, another driver from our shop went missing. Miguel. Good guy, had 3 kids. He'd taken a delivery up into the mountains and never came back. They found his car 2 days later, abandoned on a dirt road with the driver's door hanging open and blood on the seat. Not a lot of blood, but enough. The police said he probably hit a deer and wandered off confused, maybe concussed. But deer don't leave human teeth marks in the steering wheel. That Tuesday night, around 9 p.m., we got this massive order. 20 large pizzas, mixed toppings, paid in cash on delivery. The address was just GPS coordinates, no street name, no house number. My manager, Tony, was skeptical, but they'd called 3 times to confirm. The voice on the phone was strange, he said. Raspy, like they didn't talk much. And there were these weird sounds in the background. Not music or TV, but almost like animals. Don't take it if it feels wrong, Tony told me, and I could see he was thinking about Miguel. But rent was due in 3 days, and that tip alone could cover my utilities. The coordinates led 25 miles outside town, way up into the Tennessee mountains, not far from where they'd found Miguel's car. The road turned from asphalt to gravel, then to dirt, winding higher until my ears popped from the elevation. My Honda Civic scraped bottom. I'm on every rut, and twice I had to get out to move fallen branches. The second time, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were other tire tracks in the mud, fresh ones, different sizes, different treads. A lot of vehicles had been coming up here recently. About an hour in, the radio died. Not static, not fade, just cut to nothing mid-song. The headlights started flickering too, dimming and brightening like something was draining the battery. Then I saw the markers. Someone had tied strips of cloth to the trees, dirty rags, pieces of clothing, what looked like a Domino's delivery shirt torn into ribbons. They led deeper into the woods like a trail, and I recognized the pattern. Miguel always wore this red bandana around his neck. Part of it was hanging from a pine branch covered in something dark. I almost turned around then. Should have. But through the trees I could see firelight, and I could smell smoke mixed with something else. Something like spoiled meat left in the sun. The GPS said I'd arrived, though all I could see was a natural clearing with several fires burning and shapes moving between them. There were maybe 30 of them. Even from inside my car, I could tell they weren't right. They moved wrong, sometimes upright, sometimes on all fours, joints bending in ways that made me queasy. Their clothes were layers of stolen fabric, delivery uniforms, hiking gear, all filthy and torn and worn like they didn't understand how clothing worked. They'd wrapped animal skins over the modern clothes, deer hide still with the fur on, worn like capes, but their faces were the worst part. Human faces, sure, but wrong. Their jaws seemed too wide, like they'd been broken and healed crooked. Their teeth, God, their teeth were filed to points, black with decay. Some were missing eyes, the sockets scarred over. Others had brands on their faces, symbols, the shiz. It looked almost like letters, but not quite. When they saw my delivery sign, they didn't act like people expecting food. They acted like a pack that had successfully called in prey. They surrounded my car before I could reverse, pounding on the windows, leaving greasy handprints and scratch marks on the glass. One woman pressed her face against my windshield, and I could see she'd been eating something recently. There were strings of meat caught in her teeth and fresh blood under her fingernails. The big one, the one who seemed to lead them, actually spoke. Not much, just a few words, but enough to chill me to the bone. "Pizza man," he said, and the others repeated it like a chant. "Pizza man, pizza man." Like before. Like before. Like Miguel. I had no choice but to get out. They'd started rocking my car, trying to flip it, and I could hear the metal groaning. I grabbed the pizzas and stepped out, and that's when the smell really hit me. Unwashed bodies, rotting meat, and underneath it all, something sickeningly familiar. The same cologne Miguel always wore too much of. They tore into the pizzas like nothing I'd ever seen, eating everything. Cheese, cardboard, the thermal bags. One child, couldn't have been more than 10, was gnawing on the plastic, and I noticed his teeth were already filed like the adults. They were raising their young to be like them. This wasn't new. This was generational. That's when I saw the pit. Behind the largest fire was a natural depression in the ground, maybe 6 feet deep. It was full of bones, and even in the flickering light I could see wallets, phones, car keys scattered among them. A Papa John's hat, a DoorDash bag, and hanging from a tree nearby like they were trophies were driver uniforms from every delivery service in 3 counties. The big one grabbed my arm, his fingers impossibly strong, and started dragging me toward their main fire. They had meat cooking on spits, and as we got closer I could see exactly what it was. A human torso, skin charred black, ribs cracked open. The arms and legs were all red. I gone. On another spit, smaller pieces I didn't want to identify. They pushed cooked meat at my face, grunting with encouragement. The woman who'd pressed against my windshield bit into what was clearly a human hand, crunching through the bones like they were chicken wings. A child offered me an eyeball on a stick, like a lollipop, already missing half of it from his own bites. "Eat," the big one said. "Join. Stay." That's when I understood. They weren't just cannibals. They were trying to grow their numbers. Some of these people had probably been drivers, hikers, travelers who'd been given the same choice: join or be eaten. The ones with the freshest clothes, the ones who still looked almost normal except for their dead eyes, they'd chosen to stay rather than end up on those spits. I saw my chance when they brought out Miguel's head. They'd kept it as some kind of trophy, still wearing his red bandana, jaw missing, but somehow still recognizable. When they held it up, laughing and dancing with it, making it talk in horrible puppetry. I pretended to vomit, which wasn't hard, and stumbled toward my car like I was sick. They followed, but they were enjoying the show with Miguel's remains. I managed to get to the driver's door, and that's when I made my real escape plan. Not by driving away, they'd disabled something under the hood, I could hear it knocking, but by doing the one thing they didn't expect. I set the car on fire. The pizza warmer bags in the back still had chemical heating packs, the kind that get dangerous if you puncture them wrong. I'd also been siphoning gas to save money, had a 5-gallon container in the trunk. I threw the heating packs on the seats, doused everything in gasoline, and lit it with my cigarette lighter. The explosion of heat and light sent them scrambling back, not in fear, but in confusion. Fire was something they understood, controlled, used for cooking. But this much fire, this fast, it overwhelmed them. In the chaos, I ran. Not down the road. They'd catch me there. Into the woods, the opposite direction from their pit, crashing through undergrowth while behind me the car fire spread to the dry leaves and started a real forest fire. I could hear them howling, some chasing me, others trying to protect their camp. The big one's voice boomed through the trees. "Pizza man, come back! You're ours! Your meat!" I ran for what felt like hours, but was probably 30 minutes. Branches tearing my clothes, roots tripping me, their voices sometimes close, sometimes distant. At one point, I fell into a creek and stayed under a fallen log for so long I nearly hypothyrated. But I could hear them passing overhead, sniffing like dogs. I came out of those woods 6 miles from the nearest road, according to the farmer who found me at dawn. My car had started a fire that burned 40 acres before the Forest Service contained it. They found the camp, found the bones, found evidence of at least 12 victims, but they never found the feral people. The official report said it was a serial killer's dumping ground, probably abandoned years ago. The bones were too damaged to identify most victims. Miguel's family got closure at least. They found enough of him to bury. I quit that night, moved 2 states away within a week, changed my name, got a job in data entry where I never have to leave the office. I'm vegetarian now. Can't even look at meat without seeing those spits, those hands, Miguel's head dancing in the firelight. But here's what haunts me most. I kept track of the news from that area. In the 5 years after the fire, 17 more delivery drivers have gone missing in those mountains. Different coordinates each time, but always the same pattern. Big order, remote location, cash on delivery, car found abandoned. They're still out there. They adapted. They learned from my escape. And they're still calling in their food, one driver at a time. Sometimes I get calls at my new job, and though I'm not listed anywhere, no one speaks, but I can hear breathing, and in the background, that same sound Tony described. Not music, not TV, but animals. Waiting, hungry. They remember my voice. They remember I got away. And I know that one day I'll come home and find strips of cloth tied to the trees outside my apartment, leading into the woods behind the building. The same pattern, the same message. The pizza man who got away, the meat that escaped. They're patient. They've been out there for generations, maybe longer, and they don't forget. I'm 38 now, and every night I check my locks, check my windows, check the trees for cloth markers. Because I know what even the police don't want to admit. There are feral people in those mountains, and they're not some lost tribe or mental patients or homeless camps. They're what happens when humans choose to become something else. When staying alive matters more than staying human. When the hunger becomes stronger than everything else you ever were. And they're still ordering delivery. I was 26 when I took that mail carrier job covering the deep hollers of eastern Kentucky, back when the opioid crisis had just started gutting whole communities. My wife Sarah had just had our second kid, and we needed the federal benefits bad. The route they gave me covered parts of Harlan and Leslie counties that most folks pretend don't exist, places where the old mining camps rotted into the mountainsides and family names go back to Daniel Boone's time. It was late October 2018 when my supervisor, Dale, handed me a certified package requiring signature from an address I'd never seen on my route. The label showed the Caudle family living up Black Snake Hollow, a place old-timers at the post office went real quiet about when I mentioned it. Dale said they hadn't received mail since June, and federal regulations required us to verify if the address was still active. If I couldn't deliver it, we could finally strike them from the system. "Take the 38, Dale said, sliding his personal revolver across the desk. "I ain't supposed to tell you to carry, but Black Snake Hollow," he didn't finish. I took the gun. The first indication something was wrong came at the Piggly Wiggly in Hyden, where I stopped for coffee before heading up the mountain. When I mentioned delivering to Black Snake Hollow, the cashier, a woman who'd probably seen everything in her 60-some years, actually stepped back from the register. "The Caudilles ain't been right since the mine closed in '82, she said. "My cousin's boy went up there, hunting 5 years back. Came down different. Won't talk about what he saw. Won't go nowhere near the mountains now. Lives in Lexington, works in an office." She leaned closer. "They found his buddy's truck, but never found him." The road to Black Snake Hollow split off Route 421 just past the abandoned Jeremiah Baptist Church, where kudzu had swallowed everything but the steeple. My postal truck's GPS worked for exactly 4.7 miles before the signal died. I know because I was watching it, wondering how anyone lived where satellites couldn't reach. But there were signs, all right. Hand-painted boards nailed to trees, caudal with arrows, and underneath, symbols that weren't quite letters, weren't quite pictures, like someone was trying to remember how to write. The dirt road narrowed until branches scraped both sides of my truck. The forest here was wrong. Too quiet. No birds, no insects. Just the sound of my engine grinding up the grade. At mile 7, I passed the first marker. A mailbox on a post, but not normal. It was made from bones. Deer, I hoped. Wired together with strips of aluminum clearly torn from other mailboxes. Inside were teeth. Human teeth, arranged in rows like some kind of offering. I should have turned around then. But I kept thinking about Dale's face, about federal regulations, about proving I wasn't some city boy scared of hillbillies. Stupid pride. The road got worse. I had to move 3 fallen trees, and each time I got out, I felt watched. Not just observed, studied, like something was learning how I moved. The air tasted wrong up there, metallic and thick, like breathing next to a burnt electrical panel. My truck's radio started playing backwards. Not the music, but the DJ's voice, reversed and distorted. I turned it off, but it kept happening, getting louder each time I switched it off until I finally yanked the fuse. At mile 10, the forest opened into a clearing, and I understood why nobody came back from Black Snake Hollow Hole. It wasn't a home. It was a nest. Shipping containers, at least 12, had been dragged up here somehow and cut open, connected with tunnels made from school buses with the wheels removed. Road signs from 3 states formed walls. A FedEx truck, rusted to hell, served as what looked like their main entrance. The whole compound was surrounded by a fence made of shopping carts woven together with electrical wire that still had Commonwealth Edison tags on it. And uniforms, hundreds of uniforms, hung from poles like flags. Postal, UPS, police, utility workers, even a Domino's delivery shirt, all sun-bleached and rotating in wind I couldn't feel. I parked 50 feet from the main entrance and loaded Dale's .38, keeping it in my jacket pocket. I grabbed the package and my signature device, locked the truck, and walked toward what I hoped was the front door. The smell hit me first. Rotting meat, shit, and something chemical like battery acid. Then I saw the bones in the yard, picked clean and arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly, like they were vibrating at a frequency that made my eyes water. The woman who emerged from behind a tarp door wasn't old, maybe 35, but her body moved wrong, joints bending in too many places like she'd forgotten the limits of human anatomy. Her teeth were filed to points, all of them, and her fingernails had grown into yellowed spirals she'd sharpened into claws. She wore a postal uniform, my size I noticed, covered in brown stains I didn't want to identify. She saw my uniform and made a sound I'll never forget. Started as a laugh, became a scream, ended as something between a purr and a growl. She reached for my chest, and I stepped back. But she wasn't attacking. She was comparing, looking at her uniform, then mine, feeling the fabric like she was trying to remember something. Then she spoke. One word, but wrong, like playing a human voice through broken speakers. Ma'ul. More came out. From holes in the ground I hadn't noticed. From inside the buses. Crawling out from under the FedEx truck. Maybe 20 of them. All ages. All wrong. A kid, couldn't be more than 8, walked on all fours but with his limbs reversed, knees bending forward, elbows back. An old man's beard had grown into his chest, the hair weaving through his ribs which were visible through. Tears in his skin. They all wore pieces of uniforms, a cap here, a name tag there. One woman had a full UPS outfit but wore it inside out, the seams bleeding where they rubbed. They surrounded me, sniffing like dogs but looking with human eyes that had too much white showing. The woman who'd spoken grabbed my hand with her filed claws and pulled me toward the compound. Her strength was impossible. I weighed 200 pounds and she dragged me like a child's toy. Inside the main shipping container I found their shrine and understood everything. The walls were covered in licenses, driver's licenses, CDLs, employee IDs, all from delivery drivers and mail carriers going back decades. Hundreds of them, arranged by year. The oldest was from 1983. Davidson, Earl, USPS. The newest was from last week. Rodriguez, Miguel, Amazon delivery. I knew Miguel. We'd had beers together. His wife was pregnant. But that wasn't the worst part. In the center of the room, they'd built something from mail sorting equipment and human bones. A throne or altar, I couldn't tell which, and sitting on it was something that used to be a man. He wore a complete postal supervisor uniform from maybe the 1980s, but his body had grown into it. Through it, the fabric merged with his skin. His face still had human features, but stretched, like someone had pulled taffy. His eyes tracked me, intelligent and hungry. He stood up, unfolded, might be better. He was at least 8 feet tall, and walked over with movements that looked like stop-motion animation. Too smooth and too jerky at the same time. He smelled like old paper and gangrene. When he opened his mouth, moths flew out, their wings covered in tiny handwritten addresses. "You bring tribute," he said, and his voice was clear, educated, horrifyingly normal. "The mail must go through. Neither snow nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom soon night." He laughed, and 3 tongues flickered in his mouth. "I was a postmaster, in Hazard, 1983. The mine closed, the town died, but the mail must go through." He gestured to a door made from a garage panel. Behind it I could hear breathing, shuffling, chains dragging. "My carriers," he said. "Still delivering, still serving. Would you like to meet them?" The woman with filed teeth opened the door. "I've worked trauma scenes. I've seen death. But what was in that room broke something in my mind that's never healed. They were still alive, the drivers, some of them. Or at least parts of them were. They'd been modified. Arms replaced with makeshift wings made from delivery bags, legs fused together and mounted on mail cart wheels. One man, his name tag said Kim S., had his mouth stretched open permanently, packages shoved inside like he was a human mailbox. They moved in patterns, trying to sort mail that wasn't there, deliver packages to addresses that didn't exist, their minds gone but their bodies still following the last routines they remembered. The postmaster thing touched my uniform with fingers that had too many joints. "You'll fit perfectly. The morning route is available. Davidson had it, but he's been promoted to overnight delivery." He gestured to something hanging from the ceiling that might have been Davidson, might have been several Davidsons sewn together. That's when I remembered Dale's gun. I didn't go for it. That would have been suicide. Instead, I pulled out my scanner and the package. "Signature first," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Regulations." The postmaster laughed again, those moths spiraling around his head. "Regulations. Yes, always follow regulations." He took the scanner with hands that were mostly human and signed with a flourish. The name he wrote hurt to look at, letters that squirmed and rearranged themselves. "Now," he said, "your orientation begins." I shot him in the face. Dale's .38 punched a hole through his skull, but instead of blood, mail poured out. Thousands of letters, PACA, Jez, certified mail, all addressed to people who'd been dead for decades. He screamed, not with his mouth, but with the sound of every delivery truck horn at once, and reached for me with arms that suddenly had too many elbows. I ran. They followed. Not running, but flowing, their bodies moving in ways that shouldn't exist. The woman with filed teeth galloped on all fours, her head rotating 360 degrees to track me. The reversed limb kids scuttled up trees and leaped between them. Behind us, the postmaster thing bellowed commands in a language that sounded like zip codes being screamed. I made it to my truck, but they'd done something to it. The wheels were gone. No, they were there, but aged decades in minutes, rusted to nothing. The engine was full of dirt and bones. The radio was playing my voice, saying things I'd never said, calling for help in words that weren't English. So I ran down the mountain, 10 miles. They followed for 8 of them. The old man with the beard through his ribs kept pace beside me, occasionally trying to hand me packages that materialized from his exposed organs. The woman clicked her filed teeth in rhythm like she was keeping time. Above us, something that might have been 3 drivers, fused together, glided between the trees on those delivery bag wings, dropping letters that turned to moths when they hit the ground. At mile 2, they stopped, just froze like someone hit pause, all of them staring at me with those 2 white eyes. The postmaster's voice echoed through the trees, speaking in that educated, horrible tone. "The mail must go through. You'll return. They always return. The route must be completed." I ran until I hit Route 421, where a trucker found me collapsed on the center line, covered in blood that wasn't mine, and clutching a package scanner showing a signature that kept changing into different names. The sheriff's department found my truck the next day, sitting in the post office parking lot in Hazard, keys in the ignition, motor running. It had been completely rebuilt with parts from vehicles that had been missing for decades. The radio played a recording of screams that linguistic experts said were in 17 different languages, some of them extinct. They never found Black Snake Hollow. 6 deputies went up that mountain road with GPS, cameras, the works. The road dead-ended after 4 miles at a rock wall that looked like it had been there since the mountain formed. But sometimes packages appear at the Hazard post office addressed from Black Snake Hollow. Inside are teeth, driver's licenses, and notes written in handwriting that changes mid-sentence from human to something else. Dale believed me. He retired the next week, moved to Florida, gave me his .38 to keep. I told him I'd used all 6 bullets, but that was a lie. I'd only fired once. The other 5 bullets had turned to teeth in the cylinder, human molars with cavity fillings that matched missing drivers from the 1990s. I work armed security now, night shifts at a warehouse in Lexington. No driving, no deliveries, no mountains. But sometimes packages arrive addressed to me with no return label. Inside are photos of my truck, still driving those mountain roads, with something wearing my spare uniform at the wheel. Its face is mine, but wrong, stretched and modified, improved for delivery efficiency. Last week, Sarah found a note in our mailbox. No postmark, no stamp. Just one line in handwriting I recognized as my own from the future. Route incomplete. Return to sender. I'm moving my family to Arizona next month. Somewhere flat. Somewhere with no mountains, no hollers, no places where the mail stops being delivered but the carriers never stop working. But I know it won't matter. Because 2 nights ago, I woke up at 3 a.m. to find my postal uniform laid out on the bedroom chair, the uniform I'd burned 5 years ago. It was clean, pressed, and smelled like mountain air and motor oil. The name tag had changed. It used to say Williams T. Now it says, returning soon. The mail must go through. And somewhere in Black Snake Hollow, in a compound that shouldn't exist, the postmaster is preparing my route. They're patient up there. They've got all the time in the world. After all, neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. Not even death. Not anymore. I was 29 when I took the school bus driving job nobody else wanted. My wife had walked out 2 months earlier, came home from a 12-hour shift to find half the house empty and a note on the kitchen table. Said I was never present anyway, might as well make it official. Can't say she was wrong. I'd been working maintenance at the paper mill in Canton for 8 years, pulling doubles whenever they'd let me. Trying to save up for... hell, I don't even remember what I was saving for anymore. The mountain routes paid extra because nobody wanted them. You had to navigate roads that weren't on any GPS, deal with bridges that might or might not hold a bus, and start your morning at 4:30 to reach kids living so far back in the hollers that their parents couldn't, or wouldn't, drive them to the pickup points. The supervisor, Mrs. Garrett, she was real clear about that when she hired me. These families don't trust outsiders, she'd said, sliding me the route map. Some of them, their people have been on that same land since before the Civil War. You don't ask questions, you don't judge what you see, and you sure as hell don't report anything to social services unless a child's in immediate danger. Understood? I understood. Needed the job too bad to argue anyway. The first few weeks went smooth enough. I learned which roads turned to soup when it rained, where to honk twice to let the Jenkins kids know I was coming, how to navigate around Old Man Morrison's dogs that liked to sleep right in the middle of the dirt track. The kids were quiet mostly, some of them walking 2 miles just to reach where I could safely turn the bus around. Mountain kids, tough as boot leather, carrying their younger siblings on their backs through the morning fog. Then Mrs. Garrett called me into her office on a Thursday afternoon. September 23rd. I remember because it was my daughter's birthday. I was planning to call her that evening, see if her mother would actually let me talk to her this time. Got a situation, Mrs. Garrett said, and I could tell by how she was fidgeting with her coffee mug that something was off. Had a woman come in here 2 weeks back and rolled 3 children. Said they lived up past Bent Creek almost to the Tennessee line. Gave me this. She handed me an enrollment form. The handwriting looked like someone had held the pen in their fist, all shaky and uneven. The address wasn't really an address at all, just landmarks. Past the Burnt Oak, follow creek 2 miles, right at the Bearhead Rock. Look for the yellow ribbons. Thing is, Mrs. Garrett continued, these kids haven't shown up once. No phone number that works. I need someone to check on them. Make sure everything's okay. Why me? Because you don't spook easy and you keep your mouth shut. She leaned back in her chair and it creaked like everything does when it's old and carrying too much weight. And because I got a bad feeling about this one, Dale, the woman who brought this form, something wasn't right. Her clothes were all wrong, like she'd pulled them from different people's closets. And the smell, she shook her head. Just check it out. Take the bus. Make it official. I should have said no. Looking back, every instinct I'd developed in 29 years of life was screaming at me to walk away. But I needed that job, needed the routine, needed something to fill the empty hours where I used to have a family. I headed out the next morning, Friday, figuring I'd scout the location before attempting it in the dark come Monday. Took the empty bus because Mrs. Garrett insisted. They need to see you're legitimate. See the yellow bus. Though I couldn't imagine why that mattered. The roads past Bent Creek were worse than anything on my regular route. The pavement gave, up about 3 miles past the Baptist church, surrendering to gravel that hadn't seen a county truck in years. Then the gravel thinned to dirt, and the dirt became 2 ruts with grass, growing down the middle. The bus groaned and scraped, branches shrieking against the yellow paint like they were trying to hold us back. The temperature dropped fast as I climbed. September in the valleys was still warm, but up here, my breath was fogging the windshield, and I had to keep wiping it with my sleeve to see. The trees pressed in closer, older, their trunks twisted in ways that didn't look natural. No power lines up here, no mailboxes, no signs that anybody had any business being this far from civilization. I found the burnt oak, a massive black skeleton of a tree that looked like it had been struck by lightning decades ago. The creek was more of a trickle, but I could follow it. The Bearhead Rock actually did look like a bear's head if you squinted, And beyond that, I saw them. Yellow ribbons tied to tree branches, leading deeper into the woods. The road, if you could call it that, ended at a clearing that made my stomach drop. It wasn't a homestead. It wasn't even a camp. It was... Christ, how do I even describe it? Imagine if someone who had never seen a house tried to build one from a description they'd heard third hand. There were structures dug into the hillside, reinforced with whatever could be scavenged. Car doors, street signs, shopping carts hammered flat. Tarps stretched between trees created covered walkways. Smoke drifted from holes in the ground that must have been cooking fires, but the smoke was wrong, too thick, almost green. I stopped the bus and sat there for maybe 30 seconds, engine idling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then I honked twice, standard pickup procedure. The response was immediate and wrong. They came out of those holes fast, too fast, like they'd been waiting just inside. Adults, maybe 12, maybe 15, hard to count because they moved in a cluster, pressing against each other. Their clothes were exactly like Mrs. Garrett had described. Mismatched, wrong sizes, wrong seasons. A man wearing a woman's sundress over filthy jeans. A woman in a child's winter coat that only reached her elbows. But it was how they moved that made my hand start shaking on the steering wheel. They didn't walk individual paths. They flowed like a single organism, touching each other constantly, heads tilted at the same angle. Watching the bus with an intensity that reminded me of how a praying mantis focuses on prey. They surrounded the bus immediately, pressed their faces against the glass, and I could see their breath fogging it up, see their tongues pressing flat like they were trying to taste the windows. Their teeth. Jesus Christ, their teeth were filed down to points, every single one of them. One woman, I think it was a woman, though the dirt and matted hair made it hard to tell, started making these sounds. Not words, but not quite animal either. A chattering, clicking noise in her throat that the others picked up until the whole bus was surrounded by this horrible rhythm. Like cicadas, but wet somehow. Then she pointed behind her, and I saw the children. There were so many. They came out of the shelters holding hands in a long chain, shuffling more than walking. Different ages. Smallest maybe 3 or 4. Oldest in their early teens. Different races, too, which made no sense if this was a family. They all wore clothes that didn't fit, that didn't match. A boy in a communion dress. A girl in an adult's military jacket dragging in the dirt. Some barefoot on the near-frozen ground, others wearing shoes that were clearly too small, their toes bursting through the canvas. None of them made any sound at all. The adults got excited when I looked at the children. The chattering intensified, and they started beckoning me to get off the bus, pointing at the largest shelter eaves. Trance. The woman who seemed to be their leader, or at least the one making the most noise, actually grabbed the door handle and pulled, her filed teeth bared in what might have been a smile. I knew I shouldn't get off that bus. Every horror movie I'd ever seen, every bit of common sense, told me to throw it in reverse and get the hell out of there. But there were children here, real children who needed help, and I kept thinking about my own daughter, about how I'd want someone to check on her if she was in trouble. I opened the door. The smell hit me like a physical thing, rot and ammonia, and something else, something musky and animal, like a den where something has been sleeping all winter. The woman grabbed my arm the second I stepped down, her grip stronger than it should have been, her fingernails thick and yellow like horn. She pulled me toward the main shelter, the others flowing around us, still making that clicking sound. Some of them touched me as we passed, quick, darting touches like they were testing if I was real. Their fingers left greasy marks on my jacket. I had to duck to enter the shelter, and once inside, I wished to God I hadn't. The walls were lined with children's things. Not just a few toys or clothes, but hundreds of items. Backpacks hung from roots that poked through the earthen ceiling. Shoes were arranged by size along one wall. School photos, those wallet-sized ones kids bring home every fall, were stuck to the dirt walls with what looked like tree sap. And there, mixed in with everything else, partially buried under a pile of stuffed animals, I saw the corner of a missing person flyer. My hands were shaking as I pulled it free. Emma Rodriguez, age 7, missing from Chattanooga since 2019. I knew this case. Everybody did. They'd found her bike by a creek, searched for weeks, and here was her photo, her actual school photo, right next to the flyer. The woman noticed me looking. She got excited, started pulling out more photos, pressing them into my hands. School pictures, family snapshots, even a driver's license from a teenage girl who'd disappeared from Knoxville 2 years back. She kept pointing at them, then at the children huddled in the corner, making happy sounds like she was showing off her collection. That's when I understood. These weren't their children. These adults, whatever they were, had been collecting them, stealing them, keeping them like pets or trophies or I don't know what. The children watched us with empty eyes, not frightened, not hoping for rescue, just blank, like they'd forgotten they were supposed to be human. One of the men brought forward a little boy, maybe 6 years old, pushed him toward me, nodding enthusiastically. The boy looked up at me and opened his mouth, and I expected him to speak, to cry, to beg for help, but all that came out was clicking. The same wet, chittering sound the adults made. They'd been here so long they'd forgotten how to be human, or been taught to be something else. The adults started bringing more children forward, pushing them at me, all of them chattering excitedly now. They kept pointing at the bus, at the yellow paint visible through the doorway. One man actually got down on all fours and did a grotesque imitation of a child getting on a school bus, climbing imaginary steps. They thought I was there to collect the children, like the bus was part of some system they didn't understand but desperately wanted to participate in. They were trying to give me these stolen kids like they were returning library books. I started backing toward the door, but they followed, pressing closer. The woman who'd led me in kept stroking my jacket, making cooing sounds. Another man pushed forward a girl who couldn't have been more than 8, lifting her arms like he was showing off her good condition. The girl's scalp was covered in scabs, and I could see things moving under the skin. Lice, maybe, or something worse. "I need to... I'll come back," I managed to say, though my throat felt like it was closing up. "Need more buses, for all the children." They understood that somehow. The chattering reached a fever, pitch, excited, and horrible. They started organizing the children into groups, pushing them into rough lines. I counted at least 20 kids, maybe more in the shadows. All of them silent except for that occasional clicking. I backed out of the shelter and they followed me to the bus. Some of them were carrying smaller children now, holding them up toward the windows. When I got in and started the engine, they pressed against the doors, their filed teeth scraping against the glass. A few actually tried to push children through the windows I'd left cracked for ventilation. I put it in reverse, moving as slowly as I could without stalling. They ran alongside, some of them for nearly a mile, still trying to hand me children through the windows. 3 kids had climbed onto the back bumper, clinging to it with unnatural strength. 2 more were hanging from the side mirrors. When I finally reached the main road and stopped to clear my head, to figure out what to do, I realized something. There were children in the bus. 2 of them, huddled in the very back seat. They must have climbed in through a window while the adults were distracting me. They didn't speak, didn't cry, just sat there, holding hands, making that soft, clicking sound in their throats. When I looked in the rear-view mirror, their eyes reflected the light like an animal's. I drove straight to the sheriff's station, didn't call ahead, couldn't find the words to explain what I'd seen. Just drove with those 2 silent children in the back, watching me with their animal eyes. The deputies didn't believe me at first, not until they saw how the children behaved. The way they moved together, always touching. The way they couldn't or wouldn't speak. The way they tried to burrow under the bench in the holding cell, piling blankets and papers like they were building a nest. They organized a raid that evening, but when they got there, the compound was empty. The shelters were still there, the collections of children's belongings, but the people, adults and children both, were gone. Vanished into the deeper mountains where even the locals won't go. They found paths leading higher into the hills marked with those yellow ribbons, but nobody was willing to follow them. Not after they found the bones. Small bones, old ones, scattered in a pit behind the main shelter. Some animal, some not. The 2 children from the bus never spoke. Not once in the 3 years of therapy the state provided. They communicated with each other in clicks and chattering sounds and would panic if separated. DNA tests eventually identified them. Siblings from 2 different missing persons cases, not biologically related at all, but bonded in a way that nobody could explain. They're teenagers now, living in a specialized facility in Nashville. I heard they're learning sign language, slowly. But they still don't sleep in beds. They pile blankets in the corner of their room and curl up together like animals. And sometimes, the staff says, they stand at the windows on foggy mornings, clicking and chattering at something in the distance that nobody else can see. I quit driving the bus a week after that. Couldn't do it. Every time I heard the engine idle, I'd remember that sound they made, that wet chittering that still comes to me in nightmares. Got a job at a warehouse in town, unloading trucks. Nothing that takes me anywhere near the mountains. But here's what keeps me awake at night. There were 3 children enrolled on that form. We only found 2 in my bus, which means one of them is still out there, still with those things that used to be people, learning to click and chatter, forgetting how to be human. And sometimes when I'm walking to my car after a late shift and the parking lot is empty and quiet, I swear I hear it. That sound. Getting closer. Like they're still looking for their yellow bus. Still trying to return more children to a system they'll never understand. The FBI investigated for months, matched 12 photos from that cave to missing children across 5 states. But they never found the adults, never figured out what they were or how they'd become that way. The official report called it a feral group with delusional behavior patterns. But that's bullshit. I know what I saw. Those things weren't just feral. They were something else. Something that had been human once, but had forgotten how, or chosen to become something different. Living up there in the mountains for God knows how long, taking children and raising them as their own twisted kind. Mrs. Garrett retired the month after it happened. Said she couldn't stop thinking about the woman who'd brought in that enrollment form. How she'd stood at the counter making those soft clicking sounds while she struggled with the pen. How her teeth had looked wrong even then. She was one of them, Mrs. Garrett told me before she left. Testing if we'd come for the children. And we did. We sent you right to them. I think about that a lot. How they knew about the school bus. How they knew it meant something official. Makes me wonder what else they know. What else they're watching from those deep places in the mountains. How many other compounds are out there full of stolen children learning to forget their names? I moved to Florida last year, flat as a pancake, no mountains for hundreds of miles. But even here, even now, I can't shake the feeling that they're looking for me. The one who got away with 2 of their children, the one who knows where they are. Because here's the thing nobody wants to admit, those kids in the facility in Nashville, they're not getting better. They're getting quieter, sure, learning to mimic normal behavior. But late at night, the staff reports, they stand at the windows clicking and chattering, and sometimes, just sometimes, something answers back. I thought, NK, they're calling them home, and I think someday something's going to come collect them. The yellow bus was never meant to save anyone. It was bait, and I delivered it right to them.